Wano is slowly etching towards its climax as we're approaching the raid on Onigashima, and I think this is a great time to really share what my thoughts are on the rest of Wano and what my predictions are for how it's going to end and how Oda is going to get there. Now, one thing I definitely want to say is that I actually think that Oda has set up enough things that he can make Wano live up to the hype that he has set up for it way before we got to Wano, and he can do so in a satisfying way that respects the storytelling patterns of One Piece and the power scaling patterns of One Piece, right? Which is exactly what we want. I think Oda has everything perfectly set up to do that. And in this video and the next video, this is going to be a two-parter. I'm going to discuss exactly how Oda can fulfill the hype of Wano in the best way possible, right? Now, what did Oda say about the hype of Wano? He has said that it'll make Marineford look like a small child's, squabble. It's gonna be completely bigger than Marineford in every way, and that is a huge, huge thing to say about Wano, right? Marineford is probably one of the best arcs and a fan favorite. Most fans would probably put it at number one best arc in the entirety of One Piece, and to say that it's gonna make Marineford look like a joke, that is a huge, huge hype that Oda's building for Wano. And so far, I think pretty much everybody is going to agree that it is not living up to the hype, right? And that's not a bad thing because it's such a huge thing to live up to. But Oda has to do a lot more. And in this video, I'm going to talk about sort of how I expect Wano to end, right? I'm going to work a little bit backwards. I'm going to talk about how I expect Wano to end, specifically when it comes to the fates of Big Mom and Kaido as the Yonkos. And after that, I will try to justify why I think it'll end in that fashion. And the second part, we can talk about the story beats that I believe will lead to that ending. And all in all, I hope I can prove to you guys that Oda can live up to the hype of Wano while doing it in a very tasteful and satisfying way for us fans, right? So let's get right into it. How do I think Wano will end when it comes to Big Mom and Kaido? Well, I think there's really four possibilities, right? If logically speaking, first is that neither Big Mom or Kaido will fall come the end of Wano, right? Second is Kaido alone will fall and Big Mom will not fall at the end of Wano. The third possibility is that Big Mom alone will fall and Kaido will not fall this arc. And the fourth possibility is that both Big Mom and Kaido, both of them will fall this arc, right? And the possibility that I'm really going to argue for is the possibility that Kaido will fall, but Big Mom will survive this arc. Now, before I get into my arguments for why I think this possibility is the most likely to happen, I do want to make a small clarification in that when I say fall, now this could mean, just losing power as a Yonko, so, just losing the rank of a Yonko along with all these territories, but it could also just mean death, right? So when I say Big Mom will not fall, but Kaido will fall, that could either mean that Kaido will lose his title and his territories, but it could also mean that Kaido will die. Now, it could go either way. We won't get into too much of the specifics of what fall actually means, which one of these two it'll end up meaning at the end of the arc, but I don't think it really matters that much, and I'm not really here to discuss whether Kaido will die or not at the end of the arc. So there are three major reasons why I think Big Mom will not fall this arc, and I'm going to order this from the least compelling to the most compelling, or at least what I think is the least compelling to the most compelling. So reason number one. The reason number one is that there are a lot of incomplete story threads with Big Mom, right? There are a lot of hanging threads of things that Oda has set up that involves Big Mom that has yet to come into fruition and is not really part of this arc, and I don't think it really makes sense to be part of this arc. And this implies that it must be taken care of at a future arc, and since these incomplete threads are very strongly tied to Big Mom, it would imply that Big Mom will be around for when these threads are tied up. So what are these threads? Firstly is the connection to Elbaf, right? This is the most obvious one. We have seen in her flashback that Big Mom has, she grew up in Elbaf, she has history with the giants, and that already puts her at a certain connection with Elbaf whenever that arc ends up happening, which I believe will be the next arc actually. Um, but you might say that, well, that's just a flashback. She had connections with Elbaf in the past, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she has to have more connections with Elbaf in the future. However, we have also seen this connection carry on to the present, right? We know that she had some deal with Loki, marrying off Lola to the prince of the giants, Loki, and that fell through, and this caused bad relations with Elbaf, or at least even worse relationships with Elbaf and Big Mom. And this just seems to imply that there needs to be more that's going to be fleshed out when it comes to Big Mom's relationship with the giants, and that cannot happen if Big Mom falls this arc. The second incomplete story thread is the vengeance of Urog, right? So we know Urog went into Whole Cake Island, took down one of Big Mom's sweet commanders, Snacks, and then was defeated by Cracker. And Rogue is not involved in this arc. His entire storyline as a supernova has only been highlighted to be involved with Big Mom. And why would Oda set that up, right? Why would Oda even mention Rogue being, invading Whole Cake if his story somehow isn't going to overlap with Big Mom in the future, right? It just seems really out of place for Oda. If I don't think leaving Urog out of the story would have hurt the Whole Cake Island or Big Mom in any way. It doesn't really add anything unless it is built up for something that's going to happen in the future, right? And I don't really see how else Urog is going to really get his chance to shine as a supernova. Pretty much every other supernova has already been involved or has plans to be involved in some way other than Rogue. And it makes sense for when we go to finally take down Big Mom after Wano to pair up, to partner with Urog and potentially another supernova to do that. So that's another loose story thread that involves Big Mom that needs to be tied up, and it will not be tied up in Wano. Another story thread that is incomplete is Snacks himself, right? Snacks was defeated by Rogue, and therefore he was completely out of commission the entirety of Whole Cake, and he was basically just only revealed as a silhouette, which clearly signifies that he's going to be used later in the story, and Oda is trying to save him for later in the story. However, Snacks, again, was not used in Whole Cake, and is completely absent from Big Mom's crew in Wano. So what is the point of that? Like, why did Oda even create the character of Snacks and keep him in the dark for so long if he's not going to be involved sometime in the story? And if he's not on the crew right now, or at least on the half of the crew that Big Mom brought with her to Wano, then there has to be another Big Mom specific arc where Snacks is present. And the final loose story thread when it comes to the defeat of Big Mom is Katakuri himself. Now, at the end of the Whole Cake Island arc, after Luffy basically defeats Katakuri, Katakuri says to Luffy, "Are you gonna come back to beat Big Mom as well?" Right? There's clearly a lot of setup for Katakuri to be present when Big Mom falls. His story seems to have a lot more connection with Big Mom, specifically one where he doesn't seem to mind the defeat of Big Mom and is kind of siding with Luffy at the end of that fight. And his words that Oda has him say implies that Luffy has to return to defeat Big Mom, and that he won't be doing it in the next arc, right? So Luffy has to either return to Whole Cake or some other island to defeat Big Mom. So it's clear that Oda has set up a bunch of different things that has to do with Big Mom and her story. With Urog, with Katakuri, with Snack, with Elbaf. These things that are not connected to Wano need to be tied up because Oda never leaves loose ends like this lying around ever, right? Everything that he sets up has a payoff, and for these things to have a proper payoff, it requires Big Mom's presence because these story threads are surrounding the character of Big Mom. Now, the second argument, so that's the first argument for why Big Mom will not fall. The second argument is the power scaling argument. I think that most people, when they want to argue that Big Mom will not be defeated this arc, will default to the power scaling argument. It's pretty obvious to look at where Luffy is in terms of his strength in relation to the Yonkos, and it's already very hard to believe that he's going to be able to take down Kaido and his crew, let alone another Yonko crew, right? That's probably the most obvious and I guess you could say the strongest argument against Big Mom falling this arc. However, a lot of people will try to wave this argument away, mainly using two counter arguments. The first is that Oda doesn't really care about power scaling, that, it doesn't really matter to Oda that Luffy should not be able to beat these two powerhouses right now. He'll just make Luffy strong enough to beat them, and make the entire alliance strong enough to beat them, just because the story needs them to be that strong. So that's the first counter argument a lot of people will use against the fact that Luffy and the allies are just not strong enough to deal with two Yonkos right now. The second counter argument is that Oda can just create some sort of shenanigans, some sort of plot contrived way for Luffy to take down both Yonkos, and the Alliance to take down both Yonkos. Now, I'm gonna try to counter those counter arguments by saying that Oda really cares about power scaling. I think if you look at the entire story of One Piece, Oda has always respected the power scaling in his story, right? Let's go through some big, challenges that the Straw Hats faced. Versus Crocodile. Crocodile was way stronger than Luffy, and how did Oda handle Crocodile? Well, Luffy lost to Crocodile three separate times, each time getting stronger and each time learning about Crocodile's weakness and just getting more and more resolve, which allowed him to finally beat him at the end, right? And now was a unique match advantage for Luffy, which what allowed Oda to power scale Luffy correctly in that arc. And then Lucci was probably the biggest example that we can look at, because Lucci, similar to Big Mom, completely defeated Luffy in the first fight that they had. Now, Luffy didn't really fight Big Mom, but they had an engagement where Luffy used Gear Fourth and a Kong gun to Big Mom, and Big Mom completely brushed it off like nothing happened, right? And similar thing happened to Lucci, where Lucci completely overpowered Luffy in his first fight with him, but in the second fight, when he went to Enies lobby and was able to fight him for the second time, he had the gears as his power up, which allowed Luffy to defeat Lucci, right? But the problem with that scenario is, one, Lucci never actually defeated Luffy, right? All he did was kind of, out maneuver him, and then he was able to send him flying, and Luffy got stuck between two buildings, right? But Luffy was never really defeated. Yet it's very, I think, even though it hasn't happened in the story, I think we could all say that if Big Mom wanted to, she could one-shot Luffy, because Kaido did, right? And Big Mom is as strong as Kaido. So I think the power difference between Luffy and Lucci is much smaller in that first fight than the power difference between Big Mom and Luffy right now, right? And any power-ups that Luffy is getting right now, like, people might argue that with his observation haki getting a power-up and his armament in Wano getting a power-up, now he's strong enough to take on Yonkos. But the problem with that is that even with the observation haki power up, Luffy still completely couldn't do anything to Kaido, right? In his fight against Kaido, he had his observation power up, but it mattered not at all, right? And Kaido was completely able to speed blitz him and one shot him. So I don't really see how an advanced armament haki is gonna make up for that difference. So it doesn't really make any sense. For Lucci, it made sense because the power gap wasn't as big, right? So it's clear that throughout One Piece, Oda cares about power scaling, right? And even against Katakuri, right? People might want to point to Katakuri as the one example of a fight where Luffy won against somebody way superior to him because Oda just wanted him to. And that shows that if Oda wanted Luffy to beat the Yonkos, he just will write that, right? However, I think even in that fight, Oda completely respected the power scaling elements of One Piece, right? Because, yes, that fight ended up in somewhat of a victory for Luffy, but it was clearly a fight of character and a fight of willpower, and it was completely a character piece of a fight rather than just a pure brawl, right? And even to the bitter end, Katakuri kind of came out looking like the better fighter. Like, Luffy never really looked better than Katakuri. At its best in Gear 4 Snake Man, he was just able to match Katakuri, and even then, the fight ended with equally shared final blow, right? So Oda Oda is clearly respecting the strengths of these villains, and he never would just make Luffy unbelievably powerful. That is not at all something that Oda has ever done to defeat a villain. So I don't think he will do that again with Yonkos, who are supposed to be the pinnacle of One Piece villains. Also, Oda has stated himself that he cares about power scaling, right? For example, in an interview, when asked how Luffy will beat Kaido, his response was, well, I can't just have Luffy, have like a really strong punch and beat Kaido because that would be very unsatisfying, right? So that just the fact that Oda answered that question like that clearly shows that Oda cares about how satisfying his story is from a power scaling perspective. And imagine if that's how he feels about Luffy beating Kaido. Imagine how he feels about Luffy beating both Kaido and Big Mom when he just isn't strong enough, right? Now, I think the biggest impact that taking down both Big Mom and Kaido this arc would have, the biggest negative impact is that it would completely undercut the tension in the story moving forward, right? Because this is supposed to be the arc where we take down the four Yonkos. Well, not this arc, but this saga, right? This huge overarching saga is supposed to be, versus the four Emperors saga, right? And if we start off this saga by beating two Yonkos at once, right? Even if it's not just Luffy by himself, it's just this alliance that takes down two Yonkos, then it's just completely undercuts all the future tension that we will have when going up against Blackbeard and Shanks, right? Because if we've already shown that we're completely capable of getting the power together and having the situation in our favor, that we could just beat two Yonkos right off the bat, then when we're facing Blackbeard, like what tension is there? We're like we already beat two Yonkos, like this is just another Yonko, right? And this completely flies in the face of the structure of the One Piece story from a power perspective, because Oda has always built up his villains, right? The villains constantly get more and more incrementally powerful, and Luffy and the tension that we're building when it comes to the specific villain in the arc that we're in, it's increased more and more as we get through the stories, right? Luffy starts off by facing just East Blue villains, then he goes off and fights the first warlord, who's like kind of like a middle to low tier warlord as well, and then he fights a god, but then it's like kind of balanced by Luffy's ability to counter his power using his rubber, and then we fight a very high tier government group in the CP9, and then we fight, it just increases at a very measured pace. And I'm going to talk about this, I guess you could call it this ladder of power in a future video more closely, but there's a clear slow progression in power throughout the entirety of One Piece, and all of a sudden to spike that power by defeating two Yonkos would just completely shoot everything out of proportion, and then the future arcs when we're facing one Yonkos at a time, it just won't really add up, I don't think. And even going up against the world government, who are supposed to be equal to a Yonko crew at least, maybe a little bit stronger than a Yonko crew, it just wouldn't feel the same because we took down two Yonkos. Like, why are we even worried about these other foes, right? Also consider that even the full-scale power of the Marines was not enough to go up against two Yonko crews, right? Remember in Marineford when they had just barely defeated one Yonko crew, and then Shanks pulls up with his crew, the Marines know that they don't have enough in them to take down two Yonkos. So it's just very hard to believe that the Allies are somehow going to be able to amass the strength to take down two Yonkos when the Marines can't even do that. So that's the second reason, is just a power scaling perspective, and this is something that everybody argues, but I just wanted to put forward why the counter arguments are kind of not valid. Now the third, and what I think is the most compelling reason for why Big Mom will not fall this arc, is because taking down Big Mom lacks one crucial ingredient that is present in every major One Piece villain, and that is an emotional motivation, right? So what is an emotional motivation? Is just a reason specifically tied to the emotions of certain characters that we have to take down a villain. And there's always one present in every villain. And you can kind of classify this into two different types of emotional motivations. One is a direct emotional motivation, and one is an indirect emotional motivation. So a direct one is where we as the viewers care about the fall of a villain because it somehow directly affects one of the Straw Hats. And an indirect one is where we care about the fall of a villain because it affects a character outside of the Straw Hats that we've grown to know and understand and get close to throughout that arc, right? So let's do a quick rundown of pretty much every major villain, and then so that we can see that for every one of these villains, there existed one of these two emotional motivations for taking them down, right? So Alvida and Buggy, we're not gonna really count them because they were just simply there to establish the world. Alvida established pirates, and Buggy established Double Fruits and the Grand Line, right? Beyond that, though, every villain will fall under this classification of having an emotional motivation for taking them down, right? First is Kuro, right? We had an indirect motivation through Usopp and Kaya. Then is Don Creek, an indirect motivation through Sanji and the chefs. Arlong, a direct motivation to take him down through Nami. Crocodile, indirect through Vivi and the people of Alabasta. Enel, indirect through Isa, Conus, Gonfall, and even Mont Blanc Cricket. Rob Lucci, direct through Robin. And then Moria was indirect through Brooke, indirect because he hadn't really joined the crew yet. Marineford. Now, Marineford didn't have any special villain, but for us to be invested in it, there was a direct motivation to save Ace, which is a direct motivation through Luffy, right? Hody Jones, even indirect motivation through the Fishman. Dofi, indirect through Law. And finally, the main villain of Whole Cake was really Katakuri, and that was direct through Sanji. Now that we've established that every villain has one of these motivations, we can see that Kaido has one, right? Kaido has been oppressing Wano this whole time. We've been getting close to the Scabbards. We've been knowing them for multiple arcs now. So Kaido has an indirect motivation through the Scabbards and through the people of Wano for why he has to fall. And of course, Orochi also has a strong indirect motivation. But what is Big Mom's motivation? Like, what motivation do we really have from an emotional perspective to take down Big Mom right now, other than the fact that she's just in the Straw Hat's way, right? Big Mom's story with the Straw Hat lacks this, right? This motivation. She's just an accessory to this arc. However, in Elbaf, there will be motivation through the Giants and a potential direct one, which I will actually discuss in part 2. I have a theory of what this direct motivation for taking on Big Mom will be, but again, that's for the next part. So Big Mom just lacks this indirect or direct motivation to take her down, right? Taking down Big Mom this arc would be a huge deviation, a complete deviation from Oda's writing patterns, and would go against everything he has established when it comes to his villains, right? So finally, putting that all together, Big Mom cannot follow this arc because for the main reason is that we lack an emotional reason to really take her down from a storytelling perspective. Then there's a second most compelling reason, which is that the Straw Hats and the Allies are just not strong enough to take down two Yonkos. And finally, there are clear story threads that are incomplete that involve Big Mom. Kaido, on the other hand, there's definitely motivation emotionally to take him down. His story really is not tied to any other thing outside of Wano. He has been part of the Wano story for decades now, and his home base of Onigashima is in Wano. And finally, there is a logical way that Luffy and the crew can take down Kaido. From a power scaling perspective, there is a way that Oda can write this using things he's already set up, and only using things that he's already set up. And this is something that we will discuss in part 2.